This is KWPB, low power, 98.7 FM, Newport, Oregon, in Yaquina Bay Chapel. It is July 7th, 2024, with Joe Joncas, teacher. Today's lesson is on Genesis 8, verses 1 through 14, the recession, the recession of the flood. In other words, when the flood starts receding. So, well, of course, as always, we're going to review what I talked about last, the 150 days. And Dave, this is just for you, you know.
Right.
Anyway, in review of Genesis chapter 7, verses 13 through 24. And I'm going to start with verses 11 and 12. And the reason I do is to give the exact day in Noah's life that the flood started, and it continued then for 40 days and 40 nights. And this is important because many people think this is just a myth. It is not a myth. And when they're talking about myths, they don't give exact days. So on to verse 13. Earlier, God gave Noah 1 week notice of this event. In chapter 7, verse 4, 7 days from now. And I believe at that time, he started loading all the animals and his family and everything into the ark for the final time that in his preparation for the flood. And in verses 14 and 16, the animals enter the ark, and then the Lord closed the door behind them. Now, notice that it was not Noah and his sons who closed the door. It was God who closed the door. And once that door was closed, it was closed. And this is the point that I made at the time, and I make it again. When grace ends, it is over. Your opportunity is past. You know, today the churches are telling the people that Christ is coming back. Many of them believe that the rapture is going to occur before he returns. And we keep telling it, and we keep telling it, and we keep telling it, and everybody just flat ignores us. And one of these days it's going to happen.
And it seems like more and more. I mean, it seemed like, you know, when the Lord started, you know, letting it be known, even back in the 1970s, a lot more people responded then that are responding now. It seems to get less and less people that even respond.
Yeah,
now they
become...
just put their headphones on. Plugs in their ears. And
you know, I think you're absolutely right. People have they've become dull to it. They just ignore it. And many of those people who responded back then are saying, well, I don't know that the rapture is going to come first, something else is going to happen. You know, I got fed that so much and they literally said the 70s. I know a woman who has said that. And so she's just rejecting the whole thing because it hasn't happened yet. You know, I got a saying for people like that. It's an old cliche. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because there are people with garbage and dirt and stuff like that they're saying doesn't mean that there's not a baby in that bathwater.
Because Jesus pointed out, said it, you know. The Father's the only one that knows the day or the hour.
Correct. And how many people today are going, oh, hey, that wasn't quite right because of this and with these dates, and I got all these dates and everything else. and we got it all figured out. It's going to happen on that date. And I don't know how many of those, one of my friends is telling me about these things all the time. The date comes and goes and it doesn't happen. You know, it's sad. The Bible says, what's the Bible say?
That nobody knows the day or the hour.
Nobody knows that that's just
But
plain
that's why
English.
people just shove it off now because so many people have come and said, "Oh, it's going to happen, and never does, and they finally are just like, "I don't want to hear about it."
Well, won't they be surprised?
And, you know,
Well,
It's like the old cartoon. The world is going to end today,
yeah.
and all week he's holding the same sign.
I haven't seen that.
that is one of Satan's major tools for discrediting the Bible. He gets all these people doubting. Well, in verses 17 to 20, over the next 40 days, the waters raised to over 22 feet. That's, in most of your Bibles, it's 15 cubits than the highest mountains. In 21 through 23, everything living on the ground died except for Noah and those that were in the ark with him. And in Matthew, and I'm not going to go into any details, chapter 24, we went into what happens, what we're expecting to happen at the end times. I talked about those prophecies, the rapture and us being taken out of here. If you want to know anything about it, go back. Go back to those videos and listen to them. Get online, study, find out if you don't know about it already. And then in verse 24, and the floodwaters covered the earth for 150 days. Now this is the peak of the flood. When we get to this point right here, totally, Moses was on the ark.
How'd that happen?
Not Moses. Oh, Noah. Well, last week I tried to accuse God of being the one on it. Of course, we know God's there, but not. Oh dear. Oh dear.
Edit, edit, edit.
No, I'm going to let people know I mess up.
That was a good one.
377 days. Actually, some people say 370 days because the first 7 days they were loading all the animals, excuse me, all the animals into the ark. So they may have been in and out. So, but anyway, that was 1 year and 17 days. And notice, 1 year and 17 days means that the year back then was 360 days long. And that's, I'll get into that more. I'm going to discuss the chronological order of the flood, going through every single thing that's in there from the beginning to the end. So today I'll just discuss that in detail. But this, as I said, this is the peak of the flood. Now, let's look at what physically happened, and I did this last week, so I'll go through it quicker this time. This is an artist's rendition of what has become known as Pangea. And this is how artists and many people have kind of figured back what should have been arranged. This is what the earth looked like before the flood. It was one huge continent. And on day 3 of creation, that's Genesis 1:9, then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the land appear," and it was so. So the waters were all in one place. And of course, as we know now, that was pretty well 3/4 of the earth. It's covered in water, and then this amount for the land. Now let's take a look at this and compare it to what is commonly referred to as a cartoon. Every time I hear cartoons, I think of Bugs Bunny, but it's this is a cartoon. This shows the picture on the left is the artist's conception, and on the right you can see how what we have today is laid out in that area. So if we go to the next one, it'll show the both, and this is really nice because I can go on the web and find this. This was another artist's conceptions. He showed it how it was before and how it was after, and so we can see North America and South America and Africa, Eurasia, how they split apart. And today, here's a map of the world, and this is showing the major ridges that are in the ocean where this thing split apart and how it flowed. So right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, it's I think I heard 44,000 miles is this ridge, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and that's where they split apart. And I'm not going to go into detail now, but today when I end, I want to show you a video that shows how this occurred. So, but let's take a look right now temporarily. Let's pretend like this is the Atlantic Ocean. On the left is the Americas, and on the right, do I have that correct, is Africa, and you can see the arrow in the middle pointing up. That's where and now my mind's going blank, the Great Deep. Somebody help me out here.
Some ridge.
In the passage it talks about the breaking loose of the Great Deep and the waters coming from the Great Deep. That's what happened in the middle there of what became the Atlantic Ocean. As that pushed up, it created lava, which created a new ocean floor. It was light, it was buoyant, and it pushed up the water, which then created tsunamis that went over the entire world. Well, we'll see how this occurs in much more detail in this video, and it'll make a lot more sense than me trying to explain it. Now, last week I talked about a video, and I had everybody watch it, Geological Evidence for a Young Earth Part 2. And in there I gave a link to that video. And the reason I'm doing these videos is I'm trying to get you all hooked into these various sources for giving you this information, so you can go beyond me and learn. Or if you're talking to somebody and say, you know, I know this is true, but here's a place that you can go and watch this and see that what I'm telling you is true, that there's evidence for it. Let's now go on to what our topic is for today. Genesis 8, verses 1 through 14, the recession of the flood. We've gotten about halfway through the flood, and now the water's going to start to recede. So, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock with him in the boat. He sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the floodwaters began to recede. Okay, now I got a question for you. Did God forget Noah? Do you think that's a reasonable thing? There's something kind of wrong with this, at least by appearances.
The translation.
It's actually, yeah, well, it could be the translation. Because in the Hebrew people would have understood this. This is Hebrew language for a covenant. And unless you understood it, you would not have understood what was said here and why. So God did not forget them, but they're saying here, because of his covenant in the beginning of this is what he's doing. Okay, and here the same Hebrew word is used in Genesis 1:2, translated spirit. It says, he sent a wind to blow across the earth. Now, one of the things that others have written, I personally, I shouldn't say I can't stand on it, I believe it. This section of Scripture, all of the flood, is God's recreation of the earth. He's destroyed the earth as it was.
And that's after the curse.
Which curse?
When Adam and Eve sinned.
Correct. Yeah, Adam and Eve sinned. They brought sin into the world. Their descendants eventually got so bad, there was only one person, and that was Noah, who was righteous. God chose him, his family, and all not the animals, but the kinds of animals to put on this ark to preserve them. And then he destroyed everything. And when he destroyed it, he didn't just kind of have a flood and have it go away. He had tsunamis go completely across the continents, totally wiping out everything, scraping everything right down to bedrock. And then as it came back and it slowed down, it put down a layer of what had been scraped off the first time. And that happened during the flood year repeatedly. And most of us, where we stand, there's literally thousands of feet, sometimes a mile or 2 or 3 miles of deposited rock. I'm trying to think of the right word for it, under our feet, and it's all evidence for the flood. So God is recreating his creation. And when he says a wind here, he's using the same word that he used for spirit. So again, there's something that, because of the differences in the languages, we have a little bit of trouble understanding exactly what was said. If we go back to chapter 6, there God was talking about preserving his creation. In chapter 7, he is preserving his creation. Okay, now I'm going to stop with the text right now, and I'm going to go on to the chronology of the flood. Now this I got this idea from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. They have a chart in there that I have, and I've somewhat copied it. I've used the general form of what they've done to go. So the first section is entering the ark. Okay, and so for 7 days, Noah, his family, and animals entered the ark, starting month 2, day 10. Now what does that refer to? That's referring to Noah's birthday. Noah was 600 years old, month 2, day 10. He was 600 years, 2 months, and 10 days old when he was told to go into the ark.
There's a birthday.
What?
And I just said there was a good birthday present.
Yeah, no kidding. There's another birthday present too coming up here. On day 7, God closed the door. That was month 2, day 17. Very, very specific. And then on day 7, the rain began falling, month 2, day 17. Now, I have modified this slightly, and there's a reason. Because, and listen to what in chapter 7, verses 11 says. When Noah was 600 years old, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, all the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents from the sky. Verse 12, the rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights. And then in 13, and listen to this, it says, that very day Noah had gone into the boat with his wife and sons. With them in the boat were pairs of every kind of animal. That means that the day that it erupted was the day that he went in. And that was the day that it was closed. So I don't see him having gone in on the very first day of that week. I saw him finally going in on the last day of that week, and it erupted, and God closed the door. Is everybody following that nonsense? Yes? Good. I see these things and I think about them and I put a lot of thought into how they are. So, the next stage was the water continued for 150 days. So the first part is 40 days later the heavy rain stopped, and that was month 3, day 27. That's of Noah's age, right? And then 110 days later, the prevailing waters receded and the ark rested on an Ararat mountain. Month 7, day 17. Now, during this period, after the 40 days, the torrential rains stopped. It might have continued to rain lightly, but the worst of that part was over with. But the fountains of the deep continued to spew out. And many of the scientists, the creation scientists, believe that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge continued to produce new ocean bottom, spreading that out, and what is now the Americas was continuing to move away, and at a very fast pace. The continents were dividing during this period of time. They may have, at 150 days, they may have stopped by then, or they may have continued. I mean, that's wide open to debate and understanding and everything else, but we can only guess at this time today. I believe that whatever happened, when the mountains were covered, and here I'm getting ahead of myself here. water receding at 150 days. 74 days later, the tops of the mountains became visible. That was month 10, day 1. So Noah was 600 years, 10 months, 1 day old at this point. Now, I want you to stop and think about this. They landed on a mountain. They said the mountains of Ararat. But where they landed had to be a high peak. It had to be, at that time, the highest peak. That was at least within their visibility, because they could not see any other mountain peaks. 74 days later, the other mountain peaks became visible. So they had to be at that point at that time. But with the things that were going on with the earth, that mountain peak did not have to stay the highest. Because mountains were forming. I mean, the continents are, I mean, here's the we'll call this the Pacific. Here's North America, and it ran into it. It only crunched like this. And we look out our window, look east of us, and see all these mountains that we had. They were forming during this period of time. The whole continent was crunching into the Pacific Ocean. And it was just crumbling up. I mean, what they had before were smooth little, it's like the East Coast. You go over there and you look at what they call mountains and you laugh. Because it's just a hill and they call that a mountain. Over here we got mountains. Tall, huge mountains. Go ahead, Dave.
The reason they call them mountains is because they're over 1,000 feet tall.
Yeah. 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 I read a story about somebody in the United Kingdom that had a quote. They had a mountain, and it turned out it was like 10 feet short. So they
Right.
went and piled dirt on top of the mountain to make sure they had the right height.
Right.
So anyway, yeah. Well, we know out here on the West Coast, we know what mountains are. We look out and we see them. 40 days later, a raven was sent out. Now, I will get into more details on that later. I'm trying to get ahead of myself here. So, month 11, day 11, 7 days later, a dove was sent out again and returned with a leaf. That was month 11, day 18. And then, 7 days later, remember when I first talked about this, I talked about 7, 7, and 7? Once a week, the dove was sent out for the third time, and this time he didn't return because he found a place to land. The land was drying finally. 22 days later, water had receded. And that was month 12, day 17. And then they waited another 70 days. Noah saw dry land, month 1, day 1. Anybody want to tell me how we got back to month 1, day 1?
Noah's birthday.
It was his birthday. He was 601 years old that day. He saw the dry land. And then, following that, the land was completely dry and Noah exited the ark, month 2, day 27. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The Hebrew calendar, I don't know about now, but at least it used to be 360 days long. And to me that makes no sense, because our calendar today is now 365 and 1/4 days. Something's not right. This is just a possibility. I mean, it's like a lot of the scientists who are just proposing ideas. The Earth was orbiting the sun. And now my mind just, asteroid or comet, probably an asteroid, came around the sun also. And here's the sun, here's the Earth that came around the sun and hit the Earth from the sun side and actually pushed the Earth into a higher orbit. So it went from 360 days going around the sun to 365 days. And that, I believe, is what possibly started all of what became known as the Great Flood, because it cracked the Earth, and once the Earth was cracked, it continued to go. Now, that's just an idea, and that's something that could have physically happened. God could have gone, boom, and cracked it, and it all went. We know, no matter what happens, God's in control. So that we can count on Him. But that's just one of my ideas. Okay, now back to the text. The underground waters, in verse 2, the underground waters stopped flowing and the torrential rains from the sky were stopped. So the flood waters gradually receded from the earth. After 150 days, exactly 5 months from the time the flood began, the boat came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. 2.5 months later, the waters continued to go down. Other mountain peaks became visible. I've already talked about this, so I will not discuss my idea again. Okay. Verse 6. After another 40 days, Noah opened the windows he had made in the boat and released a raven. The bird flew back and forth until the floodwaters on the earth had dried up. Now, let me go ahead and finish this. He also released a dove to see if the water had receded and it could find dry ground. But the dove could find no place to land because the water still covered the ground. So it returned to the boat, and Noah held out his hand and drew the dove back inside. What happened to the raven? I mean,
He's still out there coasting.
A raven is the largest of the crow family.
Right.
He's a scavenger and a carrion eater. I mean, imagine the stuff that was floating on top of the ocean at this point. I mean, we could go to Mount St. Helens in 1984 and look at what happened. Spirit Lake had and still has logs floating on it that got wiped out when that mountain exploded. The whole earth had just totally wiped every tree off of every continent throughout, not every continent because there's one continent to start with, completely cleaned them off. Many of them and all the stuff were floating on the ocean. So this bird could have found old dying stuff and eaten it and survived and had no problem. But a dove, the dove's a vegetarian. there was nothing for him to eat, so he returned. So let's look at 10. After waiting another 7 days, Noah released the dove again. This time the dove returned to him in the evening with a fresh olive leaf in its beak. Then Noah knew that the flood waters were almost gone. Verse 12. He waited another 7 days and then released the dove again. This time it did not come back. The water finally, and this is a long time. You know, those people who think the flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights are so wrong. Now, verse 13, Noah was now 601 years old. On the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began, the floodwaters had almost dried up from the earth. Noah lifted back the covering of the boat and saw that the surface of the ground was drying. 2 more months went by, and at last the earth was dry. So the flood had finally got to the point where it was dry outside. Now that 2 months, it was actually 70 days. This translation simplifies things. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an excerpt from The Ark in the Darkness, which is a documentary. 3 of you have already seen this. Unfortunately, it's not free yet. You might have to wait all the way till next winter. They promise they're going to make it free on YouTube, but it's not yet. If you want to see it, it's going to cost you $3.99 to rent a standard a standard definition. If you want a high definition, it's $4.99. If you got a big screen TV, I highly recommend you spend the $5 and watch the whole thing. But I'm only going to show you 12 minutes. I will list the several sources that are available for this, along with this video when I put it up.